Welcome everyone to ModuleQ's Thought Leadership Digital event, The Secret to AI is People. My name is Yumi Ha and I will be your host and key contact point for this discussion today. I want to start by sharing that this event will be recorded and available for digital viewing at a later time if you want to share with your network. Please also submit your questions in the Q&A area and we will try to answer as many as we can at the end of the discussion. To provide some quick background, ModuleQ is an AI company that empowers frontline professionals with business relevant insights so they gain a competitive information edge. Most recently, we're rolling out the solution to over 2,000 client-facing professionals at Refinitiv, a leading financial services firm. Now, I am very pleased to introduce our founders to talk about how the secret to AI is actually you and I. David Bruner is the CEO of ModuleQ and holds a PhD from Harvard University and a BS in computer science from Stanford. Anupriya Ankolekar is principal scientist at ModuleQ and holds a PhD in human-computer interaction from Carnegie Mellon University. Anupriya, there is a lot of vigorous discussion currently happening about what AI is, and is AI going to take over people's jobs? Why don't we start off with sharing your vision for AI and how people and AI will work in the future?
Thanks Yumi for the introduction. So I think I've always had a vision of technology and AI working in support of human well-being, allowing people to reach their full creative and thoughtful potential. And in particular, I see AI as a kind of a horizontal and pervasive enabling layer that operates behind the scenes, that augments and amplifies the individual and their cognitive processes. Fairly early on, during my doctoral work, I built a system that would scour an open source software project repository and recommend to human developers a curated set of documents, discussions, bug reports for the problem that they were working on. And this is an example of my vision of how AI can use its strengths of scale, speed, and consistency to support humans, augmenting, their capabilities, things that they wouldn't be able to do, supporting human cognition as well. And this was actually many years ago. Now AI is getting really accurate at, for example, pattern recognition problems. And I believe that we'll be able to support humans with a much wider range of tasks. Nevertheless, I think AI also needs application and guidance from humans, from a human who understands why the problem on which the AI is applied is actually important and worth solving, has a deep working understanding of the context around, and also any ethical or emotional nuances of any situation that they're in. So I think humans should really still be in charge, still have full autonomy about what they're doing, about how the AI is applied and used, and ultimately, have decision-making power, accountability, and so on.
Thank you. And you really like the concept of accountability and humans managing the AI. And that really dovetails nicely into the topic of this Thought Leadership Digital event, the Harvard Business Review article, The Secret to AI is People. On a high level, this article states that to gain a real competitive advantage, companies need to integrate AI into all aspects of their organization so that human resources can be augmented and enhanced by machine intelligence. More specifically, they have developed a 4-layered stack that includes intentionality, integration, implementation, and indication. These layers are not steps, but are layers that are all stacked together. David, can you tell us your thoughts on how the 4I model works and why they are not steps, but must be layers that have to be stacked together?
Sure, Yumi, and thank you for the introduction. I think Anupriya, my co-founder and our principal scientist at ModuleQ, set up the problem nicely by describing the way that AI can augment people. It's complementary. The challenge, though, is it's not obvious exactly how to make it complementary. What should be the division of labor between people and the AI? Because AI is really good at some things, people are good at other things. How do you bring the two together? And really figuring that out, the answer to that is going to be different and unique for every organization, for every business, depending on how they're seeking to differentiate themselves, depending on the unique capabilities of their people. And I think that's what the model that Sanders and Wood in this article put forward begins to get at. And I think they've, the 4 layers in some ways may be a little bit arbitrary, but I think they've highlighted a number of different aspects to what it takes to make this work well. And I'd like to maybe speak a little bit about a few of them, but in particular, starting with the one that's labeled intentionality of purpose. And they're saying that, well, you need more than just a goal of maximizing your financial metrics in order to figure this out. And I think it's true, but I think it's also true for sort of a more general reason, which is that whenever you're trying to innovate or you're trying to solve problems creatively, aiming to increase financial metrics doesn't really give you much guidance into how you might do that or spur much creative thinking or ideation or new approaches. Financial metrics are great if you're trying to maximize execution, if you're trying to turn the flywheel faster. But when you're trying to motivate people to come up with new and creative solutions, there's actually a lot of research in the organizational learning literature that financial metrics can even be counterproductive if you drive toward them too hard, because they can lead people to not do the kind of exploratory innovation and creative experimentation that might help surface new ideas. So I think there is a lot of truth in the need to have a vision or mission that is deeper. As we move through the model and we get to things like integration, I think really what they're trying to say with the integration point is you should be looking for where are the places that you can take a complex problem and break it down into multiple subproblems, some of which can be assigned to AI that is when they're a good fit with the AI capabilities, and some of which can be handled by people. And one of the examples that they give that I think is very compelling and certainly rings true to me is about the way in clinical diagnostics and medical decision making, the effective combination of human doctors and AI actually performs better than either one on its own. And that, I think, goes hand in hand with approaching all of this with a certain measure of humility in terms of recognizing that the technology and sometimes the technologists don't necessarily have all the answers. The people who are involved in these processes have acquired a lot of knowledge and expertise through their experiences. And so you want to approach that with respect for what the humans bring to the equation. And I think that helps build toward the sort of trust that they describe as being necessary in the implementation phase. Indication, I think in some ways, the last model is a little bit easier because it's about measuring and figuring out, what's working and what's not. But sometimes as we get caught up in the excitement of implementing these two new technologies, we can forget to focus on sort of the agile process aspects of making sure you know what's going to tell you if you've in fact been successful.
No, thank you, David. And I really love the comment you made about how it's not obvious how to make humans and AI complementary one another, and how this model sort of tries to give you a framework for how to take, like you said, the best of both worlds and try to merge them so that each component is doing what they are best at. So thank you so much for that additional context about the 4 I's and how they work together. Now I want to dive a little deeper into a real world example showing how this is so incredibly important, but also really difficult to do well in an organization. Anupriya, I believe you had firsthand experience trying to encourage employees at Hewlett-Packard Laboratories to embrace cutting-edge nascent technologies. Can you share what your key learnings were from that situation?
Sure, yeah. So what we were trying to do is we were trying to create, so this is while I was at HP Labs, we were trying to create an internal enterprise market for work and introduce it as a better means of experience and expertise allocation within the company. So the thought was that employees could find out what type of information or expertise is needed in another part of the company and help if they could. And if they couldn't, at least they would learn more about what other people are working on and more directly support and, kind of learn, maybe able to learn new areas as well. And management would learn about what types of skills are required in the company and maybe could find better ways of supporting their employees. So it was motivated by a very, very nice thought. And all people had to do was to put up tasks in the market and bid on existing tasks and so on. What we realized, though, while going through the project is that there was significant concern around what participating in the market might reveal about you as an employee in an enterprise situation, in a workplace situation, where often people and their actions are being evaluated, or at least they feel that they're being evaluated. And there's a real cost to sending out unfavorable impressions, even if they're inaccurate, and certainly if they're accurate. So people worried that if I put up tasks over there, I'm going to be admitting to a lack of competence, I can't do my job well, or that somehow I am, and if I were bidding, that somehow I am slacking off or I'm ignoring my real priorities that I should be working on and I'm participating in the market. And this was all despite the support of their managers. So we had full support of managers. We weren't introducing something sideways. And this, this kind of brought home the point. I mean, as David was mentioning earlier, understanding kind of the human angle, not just thinking from an optimistic technology point of view, is incredibly important because we completely didn't realize the cultural context into which we were introducing this. And actually, it was good that people were aware, because maybe inadvertently we might have been revealing things that would have been taken negatively. So it was this kind of natural understanding that people had to say, hey, this is good, but wait a minute, over here this could be unleashing other types of forces that you may not fully appreciate. And so that was a very interesting learning for me, at least, really eye-opening moment. And we had to, in order to mitigate that, we had to work with executives, kind of have the purpose of the project, the concerns all ironed out, and it took really this kind of 4-stack thinking through of how the project fits into the enterprise to get around this very real concern.
No, thank you, Anupriya. And this really complements the article's key point about how important it is to get buy-in from the organization when you're in integration mode. And it has to be across all the different components of the organization, not just the people who are quote unquote working in AI. And that there's this anxiety around privacy and expectations. And so there needs to be almost a testing and training period where people get an opportunity to give their feedback about what their concerns are and what they think are the key metrics that need to be targeted for the final decision-making process. So I think that's super exciting, and I love that you shared a real-world example of that. So David, you got to know Anupriya when she was looking for her next step after this fantastic HP Labs experience, and you decided to work together to figure out a way to weave AI into how people are actually working in organizations. Can you share a little bit more about your findings together? And I especially want to talk a little bit more about your earlier comment about how organizations need creative problem-solving capabilities to stay competitive.
Sure. Thank you, Yumi. And yes, it was sort of very serendipitous that I connected with Anupriya in the early days of ModuleQ and realized that we had both been working on sort of the same fundamental problem of how can you augment human brain power using AI and enable people to in effect be smarter by leveraging an artificial brain that's out there amplifying their thought processes and their cognition. But we had been approaching it from very different perspectives. And so, Anupriya had focused a lot at the individual level, the human-computer interaction level, where it's about how do we help an individual in the flow of their work by giving them more relevant information, and had done some fascinating work during her PhD studies around augmenting software developers with timely insights related to the work they're working on by having the computer actually understand, having the AI understand what it is that the person is working on. I had come to sort of a similar approach from a very different background. I started my career at Stanford studying with one of the pioneers in the field of AI, Edward Feigenbaum. He invented expert systems back in the first wave of AI in the 60s and 70s. And he had been doing research, and I worked with him as a research assistant on systems to generate situational awareness in military contexts where there's an enormous amount of stuff going on. Much of it is mission critical, and people can't even begin to process all of that raw information. So somehow you need the AI to do what AI is good at, namely boiling down huge numbers of data points, huge volumes of information into a small number of focused insights that then humans can act on. But it's very difficult in practice to do that, because it's hard to figure out where the insights are and what's noise. And so as I went through my doctoral program at Harvard, I had focused in on the need for AI to understand what we as human professionals are trying to accomplish in our work. Because if the AI doesn't understand our goals, how can it help us achieve them? And so it was a similar place to what Anupriya had been focused on around augmenting software developers, but coming from a very different background. And as we put these two complementary ideas together, we began to see that by building data fusion systems that connect the dots in a professional's workflow, we could actually start to build AI that has an explicit, a structured model, an understanding, if you will, of what a professional is trying to do in their work. So in contrast to something like Microsoft Word, which doesn't know what it is that you're writing in your document or why you're writing it, or Outlook, which doesn't know who you're communicating with or why you're communicating with them, the software that we've constructed actually has some understanding of what you're trying to accomplish. It's not smart enough to actually do the work, so that gets us to the breakdown or the division of labor between the machine and the people, but it is smart enough to be kind of like a brilliant colleague that's kind of looking over your shoulder and saying, oh, you're working on that. Well, I just saw a report that was related. Maybe you'll find this interesting, and surface it up and bring it to your attention. And if you can bring people better insights, better inputs to their work, you actually can help them be smarter in the solutions and widen the range of creative ideas that they come up with.
Thank you. And I'd like to dig a little bit deeper here. I love how you framed it up, that your research was focused on what are we as humans trying to accomplish at work, and what are our goals. And I want to learn a little bit about how you fold those learnings into what we are doing here at ModuleQ, and how the technologies and tools that you've developed are actually enhancing what us as frontline professionals are doing, so that we can benefit from this incredible technology.
Sure. So what Anupriya and I focused on as we shaped ModuleQ's technology is how we can connect the right people with the right information at the right time. And it sounds maybe like a simple idea, but it turns out that it's fiendishly difficult in practice, because what the right information is and what the right time is very dependent on an individual's context, on the kind of business that the company is in, the role of the individual. And so in order to do that, you actually need to put together an understanding not just of what content is available, which means all sorts of natural language processing and search technology to understand that this research report relates to investment banking, and that news article is about a key personnel change, and the one over there is about an acquisition. You need the content-facing AI to understand the information that's available. You also need very deep AI, and this is really what ModuleQ brings uniquely to the equation, a deep understanding of the professional's priorities so that you can then make matches and find the needle in the haystack. Because systems, for example, ModuleQ installations in enterprise settings are routinely scanning through 50,000 or 100,000 pieces of new content every day, and then surfacing up to a given individual, maybe 1, 2, 3, or 4 pieces of content out of 100,000 that are a really good fit with what that individual is interested in. And one of the things that turns out to be key to this is that AI, and I think probably most of our audience is aware that AI really refers to a whole family of techniques, many of which are actually fundamentally different in their approach to achieve intelligent behavior in machines. And so when you look at solving these kinds of problems, the right techniques depend on the challenge that you're tackling. And so, for example, the kind of AI that is used in some of the social media platforms that recommend that you might be interested in this piece of content or this product that your friend liked, that results in sort of very coarse and poorly targeted recommendations that are very noisy, because it's really just operating on a statistical black box, a mathematical model that doesn't have any real understanding of what you as an individual are interested in or where you're headed in your daily life. And so, if you do an internet search for ceiling fans and buy one, you'll have advertisements for ceiling fans following you around the internet for the next couple of years. Our approach is very different, because instead of working over a very large population and just running some statistical models, we're actually using knowledge-based approaches that have some real explicit understanding of what a professional is working on. That allows us to surface up insights that are very likely to be relevant, and our system is able to achieve 80 to 85% relevance with the content that it delivers. All of that said, it's a platform, because the particular insights that an individual needs depends on whether they're in wealth management or investment banking or advisory or some other professional role. And so you can customize this and serve up insights from whatever sources may be most relevant given the business and the role.
No, and I love that. And I love how it's not just a science experiment available now in Microsoft Teams, one of the most common office productivity tools out there. And when you were talking about the right info at the right time, it really, funny enough, reminded me of how I'm trying to teach my 9-year-old this concept of situational awareness, and how, in this context, with these pieces of data, this is how you're supposed to act, and in other ways you're not. And giving him that database to work with, so that as he grows, then he can make these meaningful connections about what should be done, where and how, and to whom, so that then he could form better relationships with those who he's around. And so I just love how the AI is sort of mimicking something that we learn as children just by failure and our parents kind of educating us about. Now this is happening, within our workspace, which I think is fascinating. So this is perfect. We are right on schedule and have time for a question from one of the attendees. Please feel free to send over any QAs, like I mentioned, questions in the Q&A section. But one of the top themes that seems to be surfacing up in the questions that we've been receiving is around what AI means for the evolution of how we work. So like I mentioned earlier, it seems that there's a lot of discussion and discomfort about how AI could potentially be taking over people's jobs. And based on this discussion, it seems that AI will not for our jobs, but will enhance and change the types of jobs we are doing. David, can you elaborate a little bit more on this concept? I think we touched on it a little earlier with our discussion with Anupriya and yourself, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about, what your vision is for the future of work and how people will be working, evolving in their current roles.
Certainly, Yumi, and also I'll share a few thoughts, but then I'd love to also turn it over to our human-computer interaction expert, who I think will, Anupriya, who probably will have more color on this. But even just reading the Secret to AI is People article, I think you begin to get an idea of how there's actually a whole bunch of supporting roles of taking algorithms and embedding them into the fabric of an organization, because algorithms are not something that you just sort of create and plug them in and they run forever, lights out, and people are no longer involved. When we look at AI, it's actually a whole process of first understanding, and we talked a little bit earlier about purpose and the why and what it is that you're trying to achieve. It's understanding where it is in the organization that it may make sense to apply AI, and then it's figuring out what data you can begin to surface about the organization and what you can begin to measure. And often these kinds of AI implementations begin to call your attention to whole aspects of the business that maybe before you just didn't have any transparency into. And that can be a very positive force. For example, with our solution, as we roll it out, we begin to see what kinds of content, what kinds of information is relevant and useful in which settings, or for professionals working with which kinds of clients. So you begin getting some visibility that you didn't have before, but that also means that then you need people to look at that and figure out what it means and how you feed it forward into better performance and more rapid evolution. And one book that folks interested in digging into this in more detail may be interested in is Competing in the Age of AI by my PhD mentor, Marco Yancidi, and also ModuleQ board member. And he talks about, together with his colleague at Harvard, Karim Lapani, about building an AI factory that is in the same way that the most effective human factories have been like the Toyota production system, involving a mix of people and machines together to drive innovation, that you want to do the same thing in the AI factory. You want to have people that are examining how the AI fits into the organization, how the division of information processing aligns with people and machines, and that creates a whole bunch of new roles. And also the data that means that those roles are actually give you a very high ROI on the new investment in high value human resources. But Anupriya, maybe you have some more thoughts there.
Sure, yeah, and I sort of have also I think a slightly different angle in that I think AI could it's changing jobs, but it's changing jobs of the individuals in a very direct way also, as in, now it gives, if with the support of AI, with the support of extra capabilities that are introduced in an organization, people can start to move up in the kinds of work they're doing. So as in, rather than spending now more of my time as an employee doing things that could be easily automatable and having an AI assistant supporting that, I can spend my time more into analyzing, as David was talking about earlier, analyzing what does this mean? What is the impact? What are maybe strategic implications of what's happening? And how can we adjust as an organization better to what we're seeing? So I think there's an opportunity for people to just be freed from the drudgery and kind of more mechanical tasks, which AI can take over, and start to get into this more creative, this more thoughtful mode of what does this mean? How can we move this our entire enterprise into a better, or at least my roles into a better place? And even I think at large in society, although we don't necessarily see this for individuals maybe outside enterprises, actually AI is opening a huge number of new types of roles for training AI. So we see that from the huge number of jobs for data annotation, for other ways of training machines. And right now it's somewhat indirect, as in people are mostly creating training data. But I think over time it'll actually get more direct, where humans are more involved in teaching AI about things that it can take on. And AI, as it gets more and more powerful, will be able to learn better and better. So I think there's a lot of potential for just the work, the flavor of work to change for humans, and the more of the kind of, perhaps you could call it boring, but the more of the mechanical kind of tasks being taken over by a machine that doesn't mind doing boring things.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, Yumi, I'd love to jump in there with sort of another maybe one of the more interesting challenges around sort of creating an AI factory and bringing algorithms into your organization, which is that, on the one hand, algorithms and AI are great because they scale more or less without limit. You can have them run at very large throughput and very efficiently. But the flip side of it is that you don't have many opportunities to catch things as they're going off the rails. And so one of the good things about sort of slow human executed processes is that people tend to notice when things just don't feel right, and not always, right? This is why we have control failures and issues like that. But there's a tendency to notice things and then you escalate and you can catch things before they've affected 100,000 customers. And what can happen that's rather different with AI is that if you're not careful, you can get something running at a very large scale and have an enormous amount of damage done, perhaps even before you've realized that it's happening. And that's an area where the potential negative consequences and the risks also, in one sense, they create new jobs because there's a whole role for people in analyzing these things and coming up with the metrics and the tracking to make sure that everything is running according to plan. But it also is just something to be aware of, the risks that are created as you begin to create what Satya Nadella describes the new runtime of the business in the form of AI. And in some ways, what we're creating is organizations where the routine execution of the tasks that Anupriya was talking about are happening in kind of an automated way. And people are tuning that machinery continuously and monitoring that machinery. And the machinery is so complex that it actually takes a large number of people to build it and maintain it and tune it. But also, if you don't do a good job of controlling it, you can end up in a situation where things go awry.
Yeah, and I'd love to continue on this thread about how we can enhance and support extra capabilities so people can start moving up, that Anupriya reference. But how do we bring people along? Because there's notion that if you want to work in AI, you have to be an engineer and you have to be working at a tech company and you have to be working in a tech role. What is your vision, both Anupriya and David, for how we can get to this opportunity that you're describing right now, where everybody is sort of contributing and providing their thoughts and working with AI, but how do we get people to there? And I think that will require a lot of training and a lot of the augmentation that this article references in the integration and implementation mode. What are your thoughts about what are the things we can be doing right now to help bring people along so that they can be part of this amazing AI revolution that's happening?
Well, I think it's a great question, and I would suggest that maybe it can kind of go in two directions depending on the nature of the role. And so, I think we've spoken a little bit about the people that build and tune these systems, and I think the reality there is you do kind of need to get technical, and you do need to understand how data works and how algorithms work, and so there is that piece of it. But the other piece is actually where I think good AI actually minimizes the need for training. Because really, when we talk about along the lines of what Anupriya was describing of beginning to have the more routine sort of drudgery in your workday just kind of almost evaporate or fade from view as it's absorbed into the AI effortlessly, ideally, there is no training required. And people just feel that suddenly they're more supported, they're more free to focus on the things that are of greater value. And I think that's where you mentioned earlier about how ModuleQ's technology integrates into Microsoft Teams. The Microsoft Teams angle here, and it's not just Microsoft Teams, it's also Slack and some of the other platforms out there. But it's very powerful when you have virtual online work platforms where AI can participate almost as if it were a virtual colleague. And as we've designed our solution, the focus for us has really been on minimizing the time to value, minimizing the amount of training required, so that it just feels like, as I was mentioning earlier, a colleague looking over your shoulder and saying, oh, here's some information that you might want to take a look at. And then if you want, you can tell the colleague whether that was useful or not. And the colleague goes away and learns from your feedback and comes back with something better the next time. But it doesn't feel like that you're tuning the levers on an AI system. It just feels like suddenly you're getting information that you didn't see before. In some ways, I love the experience of, and most of us now, of course, are not getting in cars and going to meetings, but the way that the iPhone and would tell you, leave now for your meeting because traffic is heavy, right? When you have a meeting coming up, and it was actually a form of data fusion in that it was putting together GPS data with traffic data with calendar data to understand, where you are now, where you're probably going to want to be in 30 minutes, and how long it's likely to take you to get there, and then coming up with something that doesn't feel like AI, doesn't feel like an algorithm, just feels like a tap on the shoulder that might save you from missing a critical meeting or being late. And I think that's where sort of the respect for the human element comes in, and the human-computer interaction angle comes in, of trying to figure out, how do we make this not feel like an added burden? How do we rather actually reduce the amount of time and attention that a person needs to spend on it? But Anupriya, you may have some thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, no, I think very similar thoughts. I completely agree that really the burden of coming along should be on AI rather than on humans. And really, when we make the AI be a colleague, be someone who is sort of watching the user, learning from it, and is clearly trying to help the user directly rather than kind of doing its own thing, and people are sort of trying to understand what it's doing and why it's doing that. I think those are just that is not productive, and in fact that's imposing a kind of cost and burden of interaction that's definitely not helping the enterprise. So I think having this kind of situation where the AI is really working as a colleague, as we have in Teams, where it's really very seamless. It's almost like you're interacting with another colleague yourself. That reduces the burdens. We're not talking about you're having to, you already have, as human, you already have a mental model for interacting with other humans, and you can sort of take that, and it's not going to work perfectly, but it gives you enough of a basis to start interacting with the AI, and the rest of the job of kind of managing that interaction in terms of kind of providing the right kind of information, adjusting and so on, should really be on the AI's part. And that's kind of that's what our vision is, and I think that's really the healthiest way to be bringing people along.
And just I'm sorry, I was going to jump in there just for a moment, Yumi, because I think it's, in some ways, as we talk about this, it sort of sounds obvious, right? Of course, you want AI to be collaborative and supportive and augment people. But I think what's interesting is it is very easy to end up building systems if you don't really focus on how you support the people and how the AI adjusts to the needs of the humans. It's very easy to slip into a mode of what starts out being talked about as nudges, and then what starts really being coercion by the systems that uses metrics and sort of directive next actions to push people around. And the power dynamic begins to shift to, well, the algorithm says this, and the people aren't doing it. And that can be deeply counterproductive, and especially with sort of surveillance kinds of dimensions to that. There's a lot of academic research, including by another one of our board members at HBS, that it can decrease productivity and decrease innovation.
Yeah, and I love how Anupriya stated that the burden of coming along should be on the AI, not on the human, and how that's core to ModuleQ's belief in human-centric AI design, which is what you were referencing, David, how the AI has to be designed around how people are actually working and how they need it to work. Well, this was an amazing discussion. Thank you, everybody, for your time. I want to remind you to look out for, I'm sorry, do you have?
I think we have a few minutes left, and I noticed that we got a a question about mitigating biases in the AI, and I was wondering if that's one that you'd like to take briefly in the last few minutes here.
Sure, we have 5 more minutes. So how do we mitigate inherent biases or ensure related biases in the applicability of AI in the workplace? This is very top of mind right now, so I'm very curious to hear what you guys have to say about this.
Yeah, and I think it's a tough question, but it's also one where I think there are several strategies that you can take, and one of them is around monitoring the output and trying to make sure that the results don't appear biased. But another one is to actually try to build AI that can explain its conclusions. And so this sort of goes back to what I was discussing earlier about how AI actually refers to a lot of different kinds of techniques. And some of them are more or at greater risk of sort of hidden biases than others. And in particular, when you talk about deep learning, which really is a form of statistical pattern recognition, any biases that are hidden in the training data, and it can be very hard to tell in highly multidimensional large training data sets what biases might be hidden in there. In those kinds of approaches, you can end up with real problems of bias that are difficult to detect or analyze. But if you take an approach that is more about explicit reasoning and knowledge-driven logic, and that can explain its results, there's much less room for bias to slip in. For example, if I'm reasoning off of a knowledge graph about how entities connect in a business environment, and I say, well, you've been working with this one bank, and there's another bank that has some overlap in the industries that it serves, it might be a good bank for you to go and talk with. That's a form of logical reasoning that is a recognized AI technique, but it's very hard for it to be biased in some obscure way because the AI can explain its logic and say, well, you might want to go to talk to that bank because it kind of looks like this bank in these ways. Anupriya, I don't know if you have other thoughts on how to avoid or think about biases.
No, I think you've kind of hit the nail on the head at some level, that I think being able to explain what's happening, why an AI is making a kind of recommendation will go a long way towards reducing bias. And really these biases come about because we are introducing black box models. We're saying, go learn something off of this data, and the machine learns things and it learns what's in the data. And if there are existing biases, that just comes out. And I think rather than relying therefore purely on such black box models, we really need some level of intentionality in what we're building also to come to bear. So it's like, when we're building this thing, we don't want to just kind of learn anything of the data. We want to learn specific types of things. And I think that again speaks to this more structured approach in terms of what are we building, what are we learning, that we follow at ModuleQ in terms of analyzing what people are interested in. And I think having this kind of approach really reduces the risk of biases because we are not learning blindly. While we take in, there are many things that are very subtle and that kind of get learned from the data and get incorporated into the model. At many stages, all of that is being evaluated to say, well, is this explainable in some way? Is there a reason for it that kind of goes beyond just correlation or other, that's a kind of bias that's coming in that really doesn't have a need to be there. And so I think that explainability, and then of course we take that through to the user as well, trying to show that to the user and say, well, this is why we think this is useful, or this is why we're making this particular recommendation. Again, that's I think sort of the final layer of explainability, of kind of validation and verification that our recommendations are going through.
I think, and I know Yumi, you're probably about to wrap us up here, but I think it really is interesting the way, someone just sent me an article about how one of the major social media platforms that has had difficulties in the recent elections was struggling with the fact that their algorithms were so complex that they couldn't be explained. And I was just thinking about the way that one of the features I love in our technology, and apologies if I'm geeking out a bit, but is the way that you can actually, if you want, you can go into the interface with the bot and ask for the reason for any piece of content that it recommended, and it'll actually show you all the different things that it matched on and all the different weights that were incorporated and why it recommended that particular content in a way that, at first sometimes something will seem like, well, why did it recommend that? And then I look at it and it's, oh, this was a merger, an important corporate event, and it was in an industry that I care about, and it actually did reference a company that matters to me. Oh, that makes sense. And so I do think that this idea of biases, the problem of biases, is worse in some AI techniques than others, and that should inform the approach. And going back to this article that we started with of the secret to AI is people, I think one of the secrets is having people on your team that understand the trade-offs across different forms of AI and techniques you might leverage.
Yeah, and I love how this question, really validates, David, one of your original comments about how, if you just let AI just be itself and do what it wants to without any checks and balances from human beings, you don't get the opportunity to catch things before they go off the rails, which is, inherently there might be some biases in the data because the data is created and produced by human beings and we are not perfect beings. However, we have the situational and contextual awareness to be like, oh, no, that's not okay, though. It might be somewhere within the database and it might be part of current thinking or topics that are top of mind, but that should not be happening. And then there's a way to course correct that, which is really important. So I want to really thank everyone for attending our Thought Leadership digital event, as well as the panelists for this amazing discussion. Look out for the email sharing a digital video of this discussion. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out directly to me at yumi@moduleq.com. Those who ask questions in the Q&A that were not answered, we will follow up with you directly. Thank you and have a wonderful day.